Good evening. Tonight we are going to look back on the development of the global food trade that has evolved over many centuries. This is a tale of how it came to be in various parts of our world. It is a story of varying climates, cultures, innovation, and developed tastes. The global food system touches every person on Earth, yet most of us have never seen the full picture until now. This is the story of how humanity learned to feed itself across impossible distances and what that means for our shared future. If you like this kind of video that is both informative and calming, feel free to like the video and subscribe to our channel. And let us know in the comments where you're listening from. For now, just relax and take in this fascinating story. There's a secret buried in your morning coffee, not in the beans themselves, though they've traveled thousands of miles to reach your cup, not in the sugar you stir in, though that too has crossed oceans and continents. The secret is this: the simple act of breakfast connects you to a web of human ambition, conflict, and innovation that stretches back 5,000 years. Every bite you take is the culmination of countless decisions made by traders, explorers, emperors, and engineers who transformed the way humanity feeds itself. This isn't just a story about food, it's a story about how the desire for flavor, for survival, for profit, quietly rewrote the rules of civilization itself. We think of globalization as something recent, something born from shipping containers and internet cables. But the truth is far older and far stranger. Long before Silicon Valley connected the world through fiber optics, merchants were connecting it through spices. Before multinational corporations standardized our diets, empires were already trading flavors across impossible distances. The global food system we inhabit today, with its supermarket aisles stretching into infinity and its supply chains spanning the planet, didn't appear overnight. It emerged gradually, almost invisibly, through centuries of human ingenuity and human hunger. This is the story of how we got here, how a handful of seeds carried in a traveler's pouch became the foundation of entire economies, how the search for black pepper sparked wars and launched armadas, how a humble potato from the Andes would save millions from starvation while simultaneously fueling the rise of industrial empires. It's a story of unintended consequences and deliberate designs, of triumph and tragedy intertwined so tightly they become inseparable. The journey begins not with nations or corporations, but with something far simpler: movement. 10,000 years ago, when humans first learned to cultivate crops instead of merely gathering them, they set in motion a process that would eventually encircle the globe. Those early farmers didn't know they were creating the foundation for international trade. They were just trying to survive. But survival has a way of leading to innovation, and innovation has a way of spreading. Picture the Fertile Crescent around 8000 BCE, that arc of land stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. Here in what is now Iraq, Syria, and Turkey, humans first domesticated wheat and barley. These weren't just plants, they were technologies, every bit as revolutionary as the wheel or writing. A single grain of wheat contains everything needed to create more wheat, year after year, generation after generation. This simple fact changed everything. For the first time in human history, food could be stored, accumulated, and planned for. Surplus became possible, and with surplus came specialization, cities, and eventually trade. But the spread of agriculture wasn't a simple diffusion of knowledge. It was a slow dance between migration and adaptation, between human agency and environmental possibility. As farming communities expanded, they carried their crops with them, but they also encountered new environments that demanded new solutions. Wheat that thrived in the dry heat of Mesopotamia struggled in the humid valleys of China. Rice that flourished in the flooded fields of Southeast Asia couldn't survive in the arid Mediterranean. This environmental diversity created the first truly fundamental reason for trade. Different places could grow different things, and people wanted variety. The human desire for diverse flavors is older than recorded history. Archaeological evidence shows that even in prehistoric times, communities were trading food over distances of hundreds of miles. Obsidian from volcanic regions, salt from coastal areas, honey from forested lands. These weren't necessities in the strictest sense, but they were valued. They added richness to life. They signified status and connection. A bowl of grain becomes a meal when you add salt. A meal becomes a feast when you add honey. These small enhancements mattered deeply to people who lived close to the edge of survival, where pleasure was rare and therefore precious. By 3000 BCE, something remarkable was emerging across Eurasia. Networks, not yet roads in the formal sense, but paths worn by thousands of journeys, routes marked by experience and memory. Traders traveling from village to village, carrying goods on their backs or loading them onto animals, began to form connections that spanned vast distances. A trader in Mesopotamia might exchange grain for lapis lazuli brought from Afghanistan. That lapis lazuli might then travel west to Egypt, where it would be traded for papyrus or linen. These goods might eventually make their way back east, completing a circuit that could take years. Each exchange added value, transformed meaning, and connected people who would never meet. The emergence of these trading networks wasn't driven by any master plan or coordinating authority. It was emergent, organic, the result of countless individual decisions made by people pursuing their own interests. A merchant notices that people in his town will pay well for a certain spice. He travels to a neighboring region where that spice is more common. He buys it cheap and sells it dear. Others notice his success and follow. Competition drives routes deeper, farther, into more remote territories. What begins as opportunism becomes routine, then tradition, then infrastructure. By the time the Silk Road emerged as a recognizable entity around 200 BCE, the pattern was already ancient. But the Silk Road represents something more than just another trade route. It was the moment when East and West became truly connected, when goods from China could reach Rome, and when the movement of products became sophisticated enough to support not just basic commodities, but luxury items, delicacies, and exotic foods that had no purpose other than pleasure. The name Silk Road is actually a misnomer coined by a German geographer in the 19th century. The people who traveled it never called it that to them. It was simply the roads, the routes, the paths that connected markets and cities across an incomprehensible expanse of mountains, deserts, and steppes. And while silk was certainly valuable, it was far from the only thing traveling these routes. Spices, fruits, nuts, grains, and knowledge moved along the Silk Road, each item carrying with it stories and significance. Consider cumin, a spice so common today we barely think about it. It originated in the eastern Mediterranean and was carried east along trade routes into India, where it became foundational to regional cuisines. At the same time, it traveled west into North Africa and Spain. By the time of the Roman Empire, cumin was everywhere, its origin story already forgotten. People simply knew it as cumin, a flavor that made food taste better. But embedded in that flavor was the history of thousands of journeys, thousands of exchanges, thousands of moments where someone tasted something unfamiliar and decided they wanted more. The Silk Road wasn't a single path, but a web of routes, constantly shifting based on political stability, weather patterns, and the rise and fall of powers. Cities rose at crucial junctures where routes converged. Samarkand, Kashgar, Dunhuang, these weren't just waypoints, but thriving cosmopolitan centers where languages mixed, religions encountered each other, and cuisines fused. A merchant from Persia might share a meal with a trader from China, each sampling the other's food, creating hybrid dishes that would then travel outward, spreading and evolving. This cultural mixing had profound effects. When Chinese traders brought tea westward, it wasn't initially seen as particularly valuable. It was just another beverage. But as it moved through Central Asian communities, people began to develop preparation methods, adding milk, butter, salt, that transformed it into something new. These innovations then traveled back along trade routes, creating feedback loops of culinary evolution. Food wasn't static, it was constantly being reimagined. The foods traveling the Silk Road carried more than flavor. They carried calories, nutrients, and the potential for survival. When drought struck one region, grain from another could mean the difference between famine and endurance. This wasn't yet a systematic global relief system, but it was a proto version of food security through trade. Regions that could reliably produce surplus became powerful regions that couldn't become dependent. The very structure of power began to correlate with agricultural productivity and trading capacity. But there was another kind of trade happening along these routes, one that would eventually overshadow even grain and textiles, spices. To modern sensibilities, it's almost incomprehensible how valuable spices once were. We can buy a jar of cinnamon for a few dollars. We sprinkle pepper on our food without thinking, but for most of human history, these substances were worth more than gold, quite literally. A handful of cloves could buy land. A bag of black pepper could secure a fortune. Wars were fought over nutmeg. Empires rose and fell on the spice trade. Why? The simple answer is preservation and flavor. In a world without refrigeration, meat spoiled quickly. Spices helped preserve it and masked the taste when preservation failed. They made the monotonous grain-heavy diet more palatable. But the real answer goes deeper than utility. Spices were rare. They came from distant, almost mythical places. To serve a meal flavored with cinnamon and cardamom was to demonstrate wealth, sophistication, and connection to the wider world. Spices were status made edible. The Spice Islands of Indonesia, the Moluccas, produced cloves and nutmeg found nowhere else on Earth. For centuries, these islands were the only source, a monopoly enforced by geography itself. Arab traders controlled the routes westward, carefully guarding the secret of the spice's origin. European merchants paid exorbitant prices for goods they couldn't obtain any other way. Fortunes were built on this knowledge gap, on the ability to move products from a place where they were common to a place where they were precious. By the medieval period, Venice had emerged as the dominant power in the European spice trade. The city's wealth was built almost entirely on its position as the gateway between East and West, between the Islamic world and Christian Europe. Venetian merchants didn't produce anything themselves. They were middlemen, but spectacularly successful middlemen. They controlled access, managed relationships with Arab and Byzantine traders, and ensured that spices flowed into Europe at prices they controlled. The opulence of Venice, its grand palazzos and elaborate ceremonies, was funded by pepper, cinnamon, and ginger. But this arrangement contained within it the seeds of its own destruction. Middlemen create value, but they also create resentment. Northern European powers, Portugal, Spain, later the Dutch and English, looked at the prices they were paying for spices and imagined a different arrangement. What if they could bypass the Venetians and Arabs entirely? What if they could sail directly to the source? This wasn't just an economic question. It was a technological and navigational challenge that would require rethinking humanity's relationship with the ocean itself. For most of history, the sea was terrifying. It was unpredictable, violent, and incomprehensibly vast. Coastal sailing was one thing. You could always see land, always know where you were, but sailing into the open ocean, out of sight of shore for days or weeks, required a level of courage or desperation that few possessed. The Mediterranean was relatively tame, its shores never far away. But the Atlantic was different. It was an abyss. And yet, the potential rewards for crossing it were so enormous that eventually someone would try. The Portuguese led the way. Throughout the 15th century, they methodically pushed down the coast of Africa, each expedition sailing a little farther than the last, mapping currents and winds, establishing trading posts. This wasn't reckless adventure. It was careful, systematic exploration driven by a clear economic goal. Find a sea route to India and break the Venetian Arab monopoly on spices. Each voyage brought new knowledge, new techniques for navigation, new confidence. And then, in 1498, Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope and sailed into the Indian Ocean, arriving in Calicut on the southwestern coast of India. The world would never be the same. For the first time, European ships had reached Asia by sea. The implications were staggering. The overland Silk Road had always been vulnerable to political instability, to wars and bandits and shifting alliances. A sea route was direct, controllable, faster. More importantly, it bypassed all the middlemen. Portuguese ships could now sail from Lisbon to India and back, buying spices at their source and selling them in Europe at prices that undercut the Venetians while still generating massive profits. Within decades, Venice's dominance crumbled. The center of European power began shifting from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic. But da Gama's voyage was more than an economic breakthrough. It was a proof of concept. It demonstrated that the ocean, terrifying as it was, could be mastered with the right ships, the right knowledge, and the right determination. And if Portuguese ships could reach India, why couldn't they reach farther? Why couldn't ships reach China or Japan? Or, more provocatively, why couldn't they reach whatever lay to the west, across the Atlantic, in the opposite direction? This was the question consuming Christopher Columbus, a Genoese navigator obsessed with a radical idea. The prevailing geographic knowledge of the time held that the world was round, but also that it was much larger than Columbus believed. He thought that by sailing west across the Atlantic, he could reach Asia, the Indies, the source of spices and silk. He was wrong about the distance, spectacularly wrong, but he was right about the direction. There was land to the west, just not the land he expected. When Columbus made landfall in the Bahamas in 1492, he believed he'd reached the East Indies. He called the people he encountered Indians, a misnomer that persists to this day. He searched frantically for the spices he expected to find. Black pepper, cinnamon, cloves, he found none of them. What he found instead would prove far more significant, though he never fully grasped it. He found new crops, new foods, an entirely separate agricultural tradition that had evolved in complete isolation from Eurasia and Africa for thousands of years. He found a hemisphere of plants that nobody in Europe had ever imagined existed. The collision of these two worlds, which historians call the Colombian Exchange, represents the most significant reshuffling of global biology in millions of years. Species that had evolved separately on different continents suddenly found themselves transplanted across oceans, introduced into ecosystems where they'd never existed. Plants, as animals, microbes, and people moved in both directions, creating a feedback loop of change so profound that we're still experiencing its consequences today. From the Americas to Europe, Asia, and Africa came potatoes, tomatoes, corn, cacao, vanilla, chilies, pumpkins, squash, beans, peanuts, cassava, and tobacco. From Eurasia and Africa to the Americas came wheat, rice, sugar cane, coffee, bananas, citrus fruits, grapes, cattle, pigs, horses, and sheep. This wasn't just trade, it was transplantation on a scale that had never occurred before, and it happened remarkably quickly. Within a century of Columbus's first voyage, crops from the Americas were being cultivated across the Old World, and vice versa. Consider the potato. Native to the Andes Mountains of South America, potatoes had been cultivated by indigenous peoples for thousands of years. They were nutritious, productive, and could grow in conditions where other crops failed. But they were completely unknown outside the Americas. Spanish conquistadors encountered them in Peru in the 1530s, and seeing their value brought them back to Europe. At first, Europeans were skeptical. The potato was strange, lumpy, grew underground, seemed almost unnatural, but it had one overwhelming advantage. It produced more calories per acre than any grain crop. In regions with poor soil or harsh climates, potatoes could feed people where wheat would fail. By the 18th century, potatoes had become a staple crop across northern Europe, particularly in Ireland. The Irish population exploded, doubling in less than a century, sustained almost entirely by this New World crop. Entire societies were now dependent on a plant that hadn't even existed in their hemisphere a few generations earlier. This dependence would prove catastrophic when potato blight struck in the 1840s, causing famine that killed 1 million people and forced millions more to emigrate. But that tragedy was still in the future. For now, the potato represented possibility, abundance, hope. The tomato followed a similar trajectory, though with more initial resistance. Like the potato, it's native to South America, Likely Peru or Ecuador Spanish colonizers brought it to Europe in the 16th century, where it was initially grown as an ornamental plant. Many Europeans believed it was poisonous, understandable, since tomatoes are part of the nightshade family, and some of their relatives are indeed toxic. It wasn't until the 18th century that tomatoes became widely accepted as food in Europe, but once they did, they transformed cuisine's Italian cooking without tomatoes is almost unimaginable now. Yet tomato based sauces only became common in Italy in the 1800s. What we think of as traditional Italian cuisine is actually built on a New World foundation. Corn, or maize as it's called outside North America, might be the most significant crop transfer of all. Domesticated in Mexico thousands of years before European contact, corn was the foundation of civilizations. The Maya, Aztec, and Inca all depended on it. When Europeans brought corn to the Old World, it spread with astonishing speed. By the early 1500s, corn was being grown in Spain and Portugal. By the mid 1500s, it had reached Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. Chinese farmers were cultivating it by the end of the 16th century. Corn's adaptability was remarkable. It could grow in diverse climates, from tropical to temperate. It provided high yields and could be eaten fresh, dried, or ground into flour. The flow wasn't one directional. Old World crops transformed the Americas just as profoundly. Wheat, which had been the foundation of European bread for millennia, took root in the temperate zones of North and South America sugarcane, originally from Southeast Asia, and carried west through the Islamic world and into the Mediterranean, found its ideal environment in the Caribbean and Brazil. The sugar plantations that arose in these regions would reshape global economics and drive some of the darkest chapters of human history, but they also created a new global commodity that would change diets worldwide. Coffee, native to Ethiopia and cultivated in the Arab world, was introduced to the Americas in the early 1700s. The conditions in Brazil and Colombia proved perfect for coffee cultivation, and within decades, the Americas had become the world's primary coffee producer, a status that continues today. Your morning coffee likely comes from Latin America, even though coffee itself originated in Africa. This kind of geographic transplantation became the norm rather than the exception. But we should pause here, because focusing only on the crops themselves obscures the human cost of this exchange. The Colombian Exchange wasn't a peaceful sharing of agricultural knowledge between equals. It occurred in the context of conquest, colonization, and exploitation. The Europeans who brought New World crops back to their homelands did so after devastating indigenous populations through violence and disease. The Old World diseases, smallpox, measles, and typhus, to which indigenous Americans had no immunity, killed an estimated 90% of the native population within a century of contact. Entire civilizations collapsed. Knowledge systems, languages, and cultures were lost forever. The plantation systems that arose to cultivate sugar, tobacco, and later cotton in the Americas relied on enslaved labor, primarily Africans forcibly transported across the Atlantic. The scale of the transatlantic slave trade is difficult to comprehend. Over 12 million people were enslaved and shipped to the Americas between the 16th and 19th centuries. Millions more died during capture, imprisonment, and the horrific Middle Passage. This forced migration of people was itself part of the Colombian Exchange, one of its most tragic components. The food crops we've been discussing, sugar especially, but also coffee, cacao, rice, and cotton, were cultivated by enslaved people under brutal conditions. The abundance and variety that these crops brought to global markets was built on suffering. When Europeans sweetened their coffee with sugar from Caribbean plantations, they were consuming the literal fruits of exploitation. This is not a side note to the story of global food trade, it's central to it. The infrastructure of global food systems was constructed through forced labor, and the wealth generated flowed primarily to those who controlled the ships, the plantations, and the markets. Yet, even within this dark history, the crops themselves had effects that transcended their origins. The widespread adoption of New World crops in Africa and Asia improved nutrition and increased populations, even as the Atlantic slave trade was devastating communities. The bitter irony is that crops taken from the Americas and introduced to Africa helped sustain populations that were then partially replenished by high birth rates, creating a complex and morally fraught relationship between agricultural abundance and human tragedy. By the 1700s, the global food trade had created what economists call comparative advantage. Different regions specialized in different crops based on climate, soil, and expertise. The Caribbean produced sugar. Brazil produced coffee and sugar. North American colonies produced tobacco and later cotton. Europe produced manufactured goods and traded them for these agricultural products. Asia produced tea, silk, and spices. This specialization increased overall productivity, each region focusing on what it did best. But it also created dependencies regions that specialized heavily in export crops, sometimes neglected food crops for local consumption, making them vulnerable to disruptions in trade. The British colonies in North America illustrated this pattern. Southern colonies focused heavily on tobacco and later cotton, cash crops for export. They imported food from the northern colonies and the Caribbean. This made economic sense when trade routes were reliable, but it also meant that any disruption, war, weather, political conflict, could threaten food security. The entire system was becoming more productive, but simultaneously more fragile, more interconnected, more dependent on the continued flow of goods across long distances. And then something happened that would transform the scale and speed of this trade beyond anything previously imaginable: the Industrial Revolution. We tend to think of the Industrial Revolution primarily in terms of factories and machines, coal, and steam engines, and those are certainly central to the story. But one of the most significant impacts of industrialization was on transportation and communication, the ability to move goods and information faster and more reliably than ever before. The first major breakthrough was the steamship. Sailing ships had carried global trade for centuries, but they were at the mercy of wind and current. A voyage from Europe to Asia could take 6 months or more. Depending on conditions, perishable goods were impossible to transport. The spices that had driven so much exploration and trade were valuable partly because they didn't spoil. But fresh food, fruits, vegetables, meat, these couldn't survive long voyages. The introduction of steam power changed this calculation. Steamships were faster, more reliable, and crucially, they could carry refrigeration equipment. The first refrigerated ship, the frigorifique, successfully transported frozen meat from Argentina to France in 1877. This was revolutionary. Suddenly, fresh meat could be produced in the vast grasslands of Argentina and Australia, where land was cheap and cattle abundant, and shipped to Europe, where land was expensive and demand was high. The economic implications were enormous. European consumers gained access to cheaper meat. South American and Australian ranchers gained access to European markets, and the structure of global agriculture shifted again, with more regions specializing in products for export rather than local consumption. Refrigeration technology spread quickly. By the 1880s, refrigerated ships were carrying butter from New Zealand to Britain, fruit from California to New York, frozen fish from Norway to markets across Europe. Foods that had always been intensely local, consumed close to where they were produced because they couldn't survive long journeys, suddenly became international commodities. The seasons themselves began to blur. Europeans could eat fresh fruit in winter, shipped from the southern hemisphere, where seasons were reversed. The very concept of seasonal eating, which had governed human diets for all of history, started to dissolve. But ships were only one part of the transportation revolution. On land, railroads were stitching continents together with iron rails. The first transcontinental railroad in the United States, completed in 1869, connected the Atlantic and Pacific coasts, reducing travel time from months to days. Grain from the Midwest could reach East Coast ports efficiently and cheaply. Cattle could be shipped live from Texas to Chicago's stockyards. Fruits from California could reach markets in New York. Similar railroad networks were being built across Europe, Russia, India, and elsewhere, each one expanding the range and speed of food distribution. Railroads also enabled a new scale of agricultural production. Before rail transport, farmers were limited by how far they could move their goods by wagon or river. A farmer in Kansas might produce more wheat than his local community needed, but if he couldn't get it to distant markets, the surplus was worthless. Railroads solved this problem. Suddenly, farmers in the American Midwest, the Russian steppes, or the Australian outback could produce for global markets. This led to massive expansion of cultivated land. Prairies were plowed, forests were cleared, vast acreages were converted to wheat, corn, and other commodity crops. This agricultural expansion had profound environmental consequences that wouldn't become fully apparent for decades. The prairies of North America, for instance, had evolved over millennia with deep-rooted native grasses that prevented erosion and retained moisture. When farmers replaced these with shallow-rooted annual crops, like wheat, the soil became vulnerable. This vulnerability would catastrophically manifest in the 1930s Dust Bowl, but in the late 1800s, it seemed like pure progress. Production was up. Prices were falling. More people had access to more food than ever before. The ability to move food quickly also required the ability to coordinate this movement, to know what was needed where, when, and in what quantities. This is where another crucial technology entered the story: the telegraph. Samuel Morse's telegraph, commercialized in the 1840s, allowed near instantaneous communication across long distances. By the 1860s, telegraph cables had been laid across the Atlantic, connecting America and Europe. By the end of the century, a global telegraph network spanned the world. The impact on trade was transformative. A merchant in London could now know within minutes what the wheat price was in Chicago or the coffee price in Brazil. Information that used to take weeks or months to travel now moved at the speed of electricity. This created more efficient markets. Prices equalized across regions. No longer could someone buy cheap in one location and sell expensive in another, simply because information traveled slowly. Competition intensified. Profits from mere arbitrage decreased. But the overall system became more responsive, more able to react to changes in supply and demand. Telegraph cables and railroad tracks. These might seem like purely technical achievements, but they were also creating a new kind of world, one where distance mattered less, where local became global almost imperceptibly. A drought in India could affect grain prices in Britain within days. A bumper crop in America could drive down prices in Europe immediately. The world's food systems were becoming synchronized, coupled together in ways that created both opportunity and risk. This synchronization was further enhanced by the development of standardized commodity exchanges and futures markets. The Chicago Board of Trade, established in 1848, created a formalized system for buying and selling grain. Farmers could sell their harvest before it was even planted, locking in prices and reducing risk. Traders could speculate on future prices, betting on weather, wars, or economic changes. These financial instruments smoothed out volatility in some ways. Farmers had more predictable income, but they also abstracted food from its physical reality. Grain became just another tradable commodity, like gold or silver, its value determined by global market forces rather than local needs. The late 19th century saw the emergence of the first truly global food brands. Heinz, founded in 1869, created standardized ketchup and pickles. Nestle, founded in 1866, produced condensed milk and later chocolate. Coca-Cola, invented in 1886, became a globally recognized beverage within decades. These companies represented something new: industrialized food production that could maintain consistent quality and taste across vast distances. A can of Heinz tomato soup in New York would taste identical to one in San Francisco or eventually London or Tokyo. This standardization brought efficiency and reliability, but it also began to homogenize taste. Local varieties and regional cuisines didn't disappear, but they were increasingly supplemented and sometimes supplanted by industrial products. The corner grocery store, which once carried goods from local producers, began stocking more and more items from distant factories. The relationship between consumer and producer, once direct and personal in small communities, became mediated through brands, advertising, and distribution networks. World War I marked a turning point in the globalized food system, revealing both its strengths and its vulnerabilities. The war disrupted trade routes and redirected agricultural production toward feeding armies rather than civilians. Britain, which had come to depend heavily on imported food, suddenly faced the possibility of starvation when German U-boats targeted merchant ships. The British government had to implement rationing and encourage domestic food production through campaigns like Dig for Victory. The war demonstrated that globalized food systems, for all their efficiency in peacetime, could become dangerous dependencies in conflict. The interwar periods saw attempts to rebuild and rationalize global food trade, But these were disrupted by the Great Depression. Agricultural prices collapsed, leaving farmers unable to afford the cost of production. This led to paradoxical situations where food was destroyed to prop up prices even as people went hungry. The Depression revealed that the global food system, now driven by market forces and financial speculation, could produce outcomes that were economically rational but humanly irrational. Abundance didn't guarantee access. The system could be simultaneously productive and dysfunctional. World War II further transformed the global food system in ways that would permanently alter how food moved around the world. The logistics of feeding military forces across multiple continents required unprecedented coordination and innovation. The United States, protected by oceans and with massive agricultural capacity, became the arsenal of democracy, but also the breadbasket, feeding not only its own forces, but also its allies. The experience of managing this massive food distribution network would inform post war development of global food aid programs and multinational food companies. The war also accelerated technological innovations in food preservation and processing. Canned goods became more sophisticated. Dehydrated foods were developed to reduce shipping weight. The technologies pioneered for military logistics were quickly adapted for commercial use after the war. And perhaps most significantly, the war demonstrated that it was possible to coordinate food systems on a global scale with central planning and logistics. This realization would shape the post war order. After World War II ended, the global food system entered a new phase, one characterized by American dominance, international institutions, and an explicit project of agricultural development aimed at preventing future conflicts. The theory, popular in American policy circles, was that hunger bred instability, and instability bred communism. Therefore, increasing food production, particularly in developing nations, was seen as both humanitarian and strategic. This thinking gave rise to the Green Revolution, a program of agricultural intensification that would dramatically increase yields in Asia and Latin America. The Green Revolution involved developing high yield varieties of wheat, rice, and other crops, combined with increased use of irrigation, synthetic fertilizers, and pesticides. Scientists like Norman Borlaug worked to create wheat varieties that could produce more grain per plant and were resistant to diseases. These new varieties were introduced to countries like India, Pakistan, and Mexico, along with the inputs and techniques needed to grow them successfully. The results were dramatic. India, which had experienced devastating famines in the 1960s, became self-sufficient in grain production by the 1970s. Millions of lives were saved. But the Green Revolution also had consequences that were more ambiguous. The high-yield varieties required significant inputs: water, fertilizer, pesticides, which meant farmers needed access to credit to purchase these inputs. Wealthier farmers could afford the investment and benefited enormously. Poorer farmers, unable to afford the inputs or the risk, often fell further behind. Economic inequality within rural communities increased. Moreover, the focus on a few high-yield varieties reduced agricultural biodiversity. Traditional crop varieties, adapted to local conditions over centuries, were abandoned in favor of modern varieties. This made food production more productive, but also more uniform and potentially more vulnerable to pests or diseases. The Green Revolution also deepened the connection between agriculture and fossil fuels. Synthetic fertilizers are produced using natural gas through the Haber-Bosch process. Pesticides are petrochemical products. Tractors and irrigation pumps run on diesel. The abundant food of the late 20th century was, in a very real sense, being grown with fossil fuels. This made agriculture incredibly productive, but also dependent on cheap energy and vulnerable to disruptions in energy supply. Throughout the post war decades, international trade in food products accelerated. Organizations like the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, later replaced by the World Trade Organization, worked to reduce barriers to trade. Tariffs were lowered, quotas were eliminated or loosened. The principle of free trade, long advocated by economists, became institutionalized in international law. Proponents argued that removing barriers would increase efficiency, countries would focus on their comparative advantages, trade would benefit all parties, and global welfare would increase. Critics argued that this system advantaged wealthy nations with developed agricultural sectors and left poorer nations vulnerable to price fluctuations and food insecurity. The development of containerized shipping in the 1950s and 60s revolutionized the physical movement of goods in ways that would prove as significant as railroads or steamships. Before containerization, loading and unloading ships was labor intensive and slow. Cargo arrived in various forms: crates, bags, barrels, each requiring individual handling. A ship might spend more time in port being loaded and unloaded than it spent actually sailing. Malcolm McLean, an American trucking entrepreneur, developed the idea of standardized containers that could be loaded onto ships, trains, and trucks without unpacking. The first container ship sailed in 1956. The impact was revolutionary. Loading times dropped from weeks to hours. Labor costs plummeted. Theft decreased since containers were sealed. Most importantly, the entire logistics chain became integrated. A container could be loaded at a factory, shipped across an ocean, transferred to a train or truck, and delivered to its final destination without anyone ever opening it or touching the contents. This seamless movement of goods made global supply chains feasible in ways they had never been before. Suddenly, it became economically viable to manufacture components in one country, assemble them in another, and sell them in a third. Food products could be packaged in one location, shipped to another, and reach consumers with minimal handling. The standardized shipping container might be the most underappreciated technology of the modern era. Those steel boxes, mundane and ubiquitous, completely reshaped global trade patterns. The cost of shipping a container full of goods from Asia to America dropped so dramatically that it became cheaper to manufacture products in China and ship them to American consumers than to produce them domestically. This same logic applied to food. It became economically feasible to grow fruits in Chile, ship them to Europe, and sell them cheaper than locally grown alternatives. The incredible efficiency of containerized shipping essentially eliminated distance as a significant cost factor in trade. This efficiency enabled the rise of truly global food corporations in the late 20th century. Companies like Nestle, Unilever, Cargill, and Archer Daniels Midland operated across continents, sourcing ingredients from dozens of countries, processing them in vast facilities, and distributing products through worldwide networks. These corporations became enormously powerful with revenues exceeding the GDP of many nations. Their decisions about what to produce, where to source ingredients, and which markets to target shaped global agriculture. A decision by Nestle to change its cocoa sourcing strategy could affect farmers across West Africa. A shift in Cargill's grain purchasing could influence prices from Argentina to Australia. The supermarket, which had emerged in America in the early 20th century, became the dominant retail format globally by the end of the century. Supermarkets aggregated products from around the world, presenting consumers with overwhelming choice. A typical American supermarket in the 1990s might stock 40,000 different products, sourced from dozens of countries: fruits from Chile, coffee from Colombia, chocolate from Switzerland, wine from France, spices from India, the entire world distilled into brightly lit aisles. The supermarket represented the culmination of centuries of development in food trade, transportation, and logistics. It made the exotic mundane, the rare commonplace. But this abundance obscured the complexity of the systems that produced it. Consumers saw only the end result: strawberries in winter, asparagus from Peru, coffee from Ethiopia. They didn't see the supply chains, the cargo ships, the refrigerated trucks, the commodity traders, the futures markets, the international agreements, the labor conditions, or the environmental impacts. The supermarket performed a kind of magic trick, making distance and difficulty disappear, presenting food as if it had simply materialized on the shelf. Behind the scenes, managing these supply chains became increasingly sophisticated. The development of computer systems and later the internet enabled real time tracking of inventory, demand forecasting, and logistics optimization. Companies like Walmart pioneered just in time inventory systems using data analytics to minimize waste and maximize efficiency. These systems could predict demand with remarkable accuracy, ensuring that products arrived at stores exactly when needed, reducing storage costs and spoilage. The supply chain became a finely tuned machine, responsive to fluctuations in consumer behavior and capable of adjusting almost instantaneously. The rise of air freight added another dimension to global food trade. Air shipping is expensive compared to ocean freight, but for certain high value perishable products, the speed justifies the cost. Fresh flowers from Kenya arrive in European markets within 24 hours of being cut. Live lobsters from Maine reach restaurants, and Tokyo mangoes from Thailand appear in New York supermarkets at peak ripeness. Air freight created a market for ultra fresh products that couldn't exist otherwise. It also extended the reach of farmers in developing nations, giving them access to lucrative markets in wealthy countries, though at the cost of significant carbon emissions. The late 20th century also saw the rise of organic and fair trade movements, representing a consumer backlash against the industrialized, globalized food system. These movements argued that the relentless pursuit of efficiency and low prices came at unacceptable costs. Environmental degradation, exploitation of workers, loss of traditional farming practices, and reduced food quality organic certification standards emerged to guarantee that food was produced without synthetic pesticides or fertilizers. Fair trade certification aimed to ensure that farmers in developing countries received fair compensation for their products. These alternative food movements grew rapidly, particularly in wealthy countries where consumers had the disposable income to pay premium prices farmers' markets experienced a resurgence. Community supported agriculture programs connected consumers directly with local farmers. There was a romantic appeal to these movements, a desire to reconnect with food's origins, to know where it came from and how it was produced. But these alternatives remained niche. The vast majority of food consumed globally continued to flow through conventional industrial channels. Organic strawberries at Whole Foods might feel revolutionary to the consumer buying them, but they represented a tiny fraction of global strawberry production. The 21st century brought new complexities to global food trade. China's economic rise transformed it from a largely self sufficient agricultural nation into the world's largest food importer. As Chinese incomes rose, diets changed. Consumption of meat, dairy, and processed foods increased dramatically. To feed its growing appetite, China began importing soybeans from Brazil, pork from the United States, dairy from New Zealand, seafood from around the world. This surge in Chinese demand reshaped global agricultural patterns. Brazilian farmers cleared vast areas of Amazon rainforest to plant soybeans for Chinese markets. American farmers planted corn to feed animals that would be exported to China. New Zealand dairy farmers expanded production to meet Chinese demand for infant formula. Climate change emerged as perhaps the greatest challenge facing the global food system. Rising temperatures, changing precipitation patterns, and more frequent extreme weather events disrupted agricultural production. Worldwide droughts devastated wheat crops in Russia and Australia. Floods destroyed rice paddies in Southeast Asia. Heat waves reduced yields across multiple crops. The very stability that had allowed global food systems to flourish was being undermined by environmental changes. And because food systems had become so interconnected, disruptions in one region rippled across the world. A drought in the American Midwest affected grain prices globally. A flood in Thailand impacted rice supplies across Asia. The response to climate change added new tensions to global food trade. Efforts to reduce carbon emissions raised questions about food miles, the distance food travels from production to consumption. Was it environmentally justifiable to ship lamb from New Zealand to Britain when Britain could raise its own sheep? The answer turned out to be more complicated than it seemed. New Zealand lamb, raised on natural pastures with minimal inputs, might have a lower overall carbon footprint than British lamb raised on grain feed in intensive systems, even accounting for shipping. The environmental impact of food depended not just on distance traveled, but on production methods, processing, packaging, and waste. Simple answers proved elusive. Water scarcity became another critical constraint. Agriculture consumes about 70% of global freshwater use. As populations grew and water resources came under strain, questions arose about the wisdom of growing water-intensive crops in arid regions. Saudi Arabia, for instance, once grew wheat in its desert, using fossil water from ancient aquifers. When those aquifers began to deplete, the country abandoned wheat production and now imports grain. This made economic and environmental sense, but it also made Saudi Arabia dependent on global grain markets for its food security. The concept of virtual water trade emerged, the idea that when countries import food, they're effectively importing the water that was used to produce it. Water scarce nations could conserve their limited water resources by importing food from water abundant nations. The financialization of food added another layer of complexity. Investment banks and hedge funds began trading in agricultural commodity futures, not to hedge risk in physical agriculture, but purely for profit. Some economists argued this added liquidity to markets and reduced volatility. Critics contended that financial speculation drove price spikes that hurt both farmers and consumers while enriching middlemen. The food price crisis of 2007 to 2008 seemed to support the critics. Wheat, rice, and corn prices doubled in a matter of months, driving millions of people into hunger. The causes were multiple: droughts, biofuel policies, rising oil prices. But financial speculation amplified the crisis. When food becomes just another asset class, subject to the same boom bust cycles as stocks or real estate, the consequences for human welfare can be severe. Biofuels represented another challenge to the global food system. In the early 2000s, rising concerns about climate change and oil dependence led many countries to mandate the mixing of biofuels into gasoline and diesel corn ethanol in the United States, sugarcane ethanol in Brazil, and palm oil biodiesel in Indonesia became major industries almost overnight. But these biofuels competed directly with food production. Land that could grow food was instead growing fuel. Corn that could feed people or livestock was being converted to ethanol. Critics pointed out that this effectively put food crops into direct competition with the fuel tanks of automobiles, and automobiles were winning. The ethical implications were troubling. In a world where hundreds of millions still faced hunger, was it justifiable to burn food as fuel? The rise of e commerce and food delivery platforms in the 2010s added yet another dimension to food distribution. Companies like Amazon began delivering groceries directly to homes. Apps like Uber Eats and DoorDash created on demand restaurant delivery. These platforms didn't fundamentally change where food came from, but they changed how it reached consumers. The intermediary layers multiplied. A meal that once traveled from farm to restaurant to customer now might travel from farm to processing facility to distribution center to restaurant to delivery driver to customer. Each layer added convenience, but also complexity, cost, and potential fragility. The pandemic of 2020 would expose both the resilience and vulnerability of these systems. COVID-19 created unprecedented disruptions to global food supply chains. Border closures, shipping delays, labor shortages, and panic buying strained systems designed for steady, predictable flows. Supermarket shelves emptied, restaurants closed, farmers who supplied restaurants had no way to pivot to retail markets quickly. Millions of pounds of produce were plowed under because the logistics to redirect them didn't exist. At the same time, home grocery delivery surged, overwhelming systems that weren't designed for such demand. The pandemic revealed how fine-tuned and therefore fragile modern food systems had become. Efficiency, it turned out, often came at the cost of resilience. Systems optimized for normal conditions could break down quickly when conditions changed. The pandemic also accelerated interest in local food systems and food sovereignty. Countries that had become heavily dependent on food imports questioned whether this dependence was wise. Urban farming, vertical agriculture, and local food production received renewed attention and investment. There was recognition that the global food system, for all its remarkable achievements in productivity and efficiency, had created vulnerabilities that needed to be addressed. The pendulum, after decades of movement toward ever greater globalization, showed signs of swinging back, at least partially, toward localization and diversification. But the global food system wasn't going to disappear or even significantly shrink. Too many people depended on it. Too many economies were built around it. Too much infrastructure had been constructed to support it. What seemed more likely was a hybrid future, global trade continuing for many commodities, especially grains, processed foods, and out of season produce, while local and regional systems strengthened for fresh, perishable foods. This wouldn't be a return to the past, but something new, attempting to balance the benefits of global scale with the resilience of local production. Technology continued to promise transformative changes. Precision agriculture, using GPS, sensors, and data analytics, allowed farmers to optimize inputs down to individual plants, reducing waste and environmental impact. Vertical farms, growing crops in stacked layers under LED lights, could produce food year-round in climate-controlled environments, potentially locating food production close to urban consumers' lab-grown meat, produced from animal cells without raising and slaughtering animals, could reduce the environmental footprint of protein production. Genetic engineering, including newer techniques like CRISPR, offered the possibility of crops resistant to drought, pests, or diseases, potentially increasing yields and reducing chemical use. Each of these technologies carried promise and peril. Precision agriculture required expensive equipment, potentially accelerating the consolidation of farming into ever larger operations. Vertical farms were energy intensive, raising questions about whether they merely shifted environmental impacts from land use to electricity consumption, lab grown meat faced consumer acceptance challenges, and regulatory uncertainties. Genetic engineering sparked fierce debates about safety, ethics, and corporate control of the food supply. Technology alone wouldn't solve the challenges facing global food systems. How that technology was deployed, who controlled it, and what values guided its use mattered at least as much as the technology itself. The concentration of power in the global food system became increasingly concerning to many observers. A handful of corporations controlled vast portions of seed production, agricultural chemical manufacturing, grain trading, food processing, and retail distribution. This concentration created efficiencies. Coordinating global supply chains required scale, but it also created risks. Companies focused on maximizing shareholder returns might make decisions that benefited profits but harmed farmers, workers, or consumers. Monopoly power allowed companies to dictate terms to suppliers and customers alike. Small farmers found themselves negotiating with corporate buyers who could dictate prices. Consumers faced limited choices when a few large companies controlled entire categories. The seeds themselves became sites of corporate control. Companies like Monsanto, DuPont, and Syngenta developed genetically modified seeds with desirable traits: herbicide resistance, pest resistance, drought tolerance. But these seeds were patented, meaning farmers couldn't save and replant them as farmers had done for thousands of years. Instead, farmers had to purchase new seeds each season, creating ongoing revenue streams for seed companies, but also ongoing expenses for farmers. This shift from seeds as common heritage to seeds as intellectual property represented a fundamental change in the relationship between farmers and their crops. Knowledge that had once been freely shared became proprietary information guarded by legal departments. Trade agreements increasingly included provisions protecting these intellectual property rights, ensuring that the corporate control established in wealthy nations extended globally. The World Trade Organization's TRIPS agreement required member countries to implement patent protections, including on agricultural inputs. Critics argued this locked developing nations into dependence on corporations based in wealthy countries, forcing them to pay for technologies that might have been considered public goods. Proponents argued that patent protections encouraged innovation by ensuring companies could recoup research investments. The debate reflected deeper disagreements about what food systems should optimize for: profit and efficiency, or equity and food sovereignty. The environmental footprint of the global food system also came under increasing scrutiny. Agriculture was responsible for roughly a quarter of global greenhouse gas emissions, deforestation for cropland, and pasture released stored carbon and destroyed biodiversity. Fertilizer runoff created dead zones in oceans and lakes. Pesticides harmed beneficial insects like bees and butterflies. The industrial livestock system, with its concentrated animal feeding operations, generated enormous amounts of waste and methane, a potent greenhouse gas. The very success of the global food system in producing abundant, affordable food had environmental costs that were becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Efforts to make food systems more sustainable faced significant challenges. Organic farming, while reducing chemical use, often produced lower yields, meaning more land was required to produce the same amount of food. In a world that would need to feed 9 or 10 billion people by mid century, this trade off was problematic. Reducing meat consumption, particularly beef, would significantly reduce emissions, but meat consumption was rising globally as incomes increased, particularly in Asia. People who had spent generations with limited meat access were understandably reluctant to reduce consumption just as they could finally afford it. The inequity was stark. Wealthy nations with high historical meat consumption lecturing developing nations about the need to limit their meat consumption. Solutions would need to be systemic, not just individual. Improving soil health to sequester carbon, reducing food waste, shifting diets toward less resource intensive foods, protecting forests and ecosystems, reforming agricultural subsidies to reward sustainability rather than mere production. These were all part of the answer. But implementation required political will, international cooperation, and overcoming entrenched interests. Agricultural subsidies in wealthy nations, for instance, often supported production of commodity crops like corn and soybeans that were then dumped on international markets at prices below the cost of production, undermining farmers in developing nations. Reforming these subsidies made environmental and economic sense, but it threatened powerful agricultural lobbies that had shaped these policies for decades. The question of food waste highlighted the paradoxes of abundance. Roughly 1/3 of all food produced globally was lost or wasted. In developing nations, much of this loss occurred during production, storage, and distribution, crops rotting in fields, grain lost to pests in storage, produce spoiling during transport due to poor infrastructure. In wealthy nations, most waste occurred at the retail and consumer levels, grocery stores discarding produce that didn't meet aesthetic standards, restaurants preparing more food than they served, households buying more than they consumed. The environmental, economic, and moral implications were staggering. Land, water, energy, and labor were being used to produce food that nobody ate, while millions of people faced hunger. Reducing food waste required different approaches in different contexts. In developing nations, improving storage facilities, transportation infrastructure, and processing capabilities could significantly reduce losses. In wealthy nations, changing consumer behavior, adjusting retail practices, and creating systems to redirect surplus food to those in need could make a difference. But waste was partly a consequence of abundance itself. In a system optimized for ensuring that store shelves were always full and consumers always had choices, some waste was almost inevitable. Perfect efficiency would mean occasional shortages, and consumers had come to expect that shortages never occurred. The challenge was finding a balance between abundance and waste, between variety and sustainability. The future of global food trade seemed likely to be shaped by several major trends. Climate change would continue to disrupt production patterns, forcing adaptation and potentially migration of agricultural zones. Water scarcity would increasingly constrain where and how food could be produced. Urbanization would continue, meaning fewer people farming and more people depending on food systems they didn't directly participate in. Technology would offer new possibilities, but also new inequities, depending on who controlled and benefited from it. And geopolitics would matter, as food security increasingly became understood as a matter of national security, potentially leading to more protectionism, stockpiling, and strategic competition over agricultural resources. There were reasons for both optimism and concern. On the optimistic side, humanity had repeatedly demonstrated the ability to innovate in response to challenges. The Green Revolution averted predicted famines. The development of nitrogen fixation, refrigeration, containerization, each of these represented moments when technological innovation expanded what was possible. There was no reason to believe such innovation had ended. New crops, new farming methods, new technologies for processing and distributing food, all of these were in development and might address current challenges. Human ingenuity, repeatedly applied over generations, had built the current food system. That same ingenuity, directed towards sustainability and equity, might transform it again. On the concerning side, many current trends seemed unsustainable. Climate change was accelerating, and agricultural systems hadn't adapted quickly enough. Soil degradation, water depletion, biodiversity loss, these were intensifying, not improving. Inequality was growing, both within and between nations. The concentration of corporate power continued to increase. Political polarization made cooperation difficult precisely when cooperation was most needed. The global food system had become so complex, so interconnected, so dependent on cheap energy and stable climate that it might be more fragile than it appeared. A series of simultaneous disruptions, multiple droughts, energy crises, political conflicts could cascade through the system in ways that were difficult to predict or control. What seemed clear was that the future wouldn't be a simple continuation of recent trends. The post-World War II era of expanding trade, falling prices, increasing yields, and growing consumption represented a particular historical moment, enabled by specific conditions: cheap fossil fuels, stable climate, global institutions promoting trade, and the Green Revolution's yield increases. Some of these conditions were changing or had already changed. The era ahead would be different, defined by new constraints and new possibilities. How humanity navigated this transition would determine whether the global food system continued to provide abundance or descended into scarcity and conflict. The story of global food trade is ultimately a story about connection, about how the human desire for flavor, variety, and abundance drove people to cross deserts and oceans to establish networks of exchange that gradually encircled the planet, about how crops from one hemisphere transformed diets in another, about how technologies from steamships to shipping containers expanded what was possible, about how economic forces, political decisions, and environmental changes shaped what people ate and where food came from. Every meal consumed today is the product of this history, a culmination of thousands of years of development, innovation, and interconnection. But it's also a story about disconnection, about how the very success of global food systems in providing abundance obscured the origins of food and the conditions of its production, about how consumers in wealthy nations could enjoy strawberries in winter without thinking about the workers who picked them, the water used to grow them, or the carbon emitted to transport them, about how the complexity of supply chains created distance between cause and effect, between action and consequence. When food traveled thousands of miles through dozens of intermediaries, it became difficult to trace impacts or assign responsibility. Perhaps the central challenge facing global food systems isn't primarily technical or economic, but rather one of awareness and values. The technical capabilities exist to feed the world's population adequately. The economic resources exist as well. Food waste alone represents more than enough calories to end hunger if it could be redirected. What's lacking isn't capacity, but distribution, not production, but access, not knowledge, but implementation. These are fundamentally questions about priorities, about what societies value and how they organize themselves. They're questions that can't be answered by technology or markets alone, but require democratic deliberation and political choice. The global food trade has created a world of remarkable abundance and persistent scarcity, of sophisticated efficiency and shocking waste, of unprecedented connection and profound alienation. It has lifted millions from hunger while displacing millions more. It has diversified diets and homogenized them. It has generated wealth and concentrated power. These contradictions aren't errors or bugs in the system. They're features, consequences of optimizing for some values while neglecting others. Any attempt to transform food systems must grapple with these contradictions honestly, recognizing that different people and communities have different needs and priorities. Looking back across 5,000 years of food trade, from the first exchanges along ancient trade routes to today's global supply chains, certain patterns emerge. Trade has consistently been driven by desire for flavor, variety, status, profit. It has always been enabled by technology: better ships, better roads, better preservation methods. It has been shaped by power, empires, corporations, international institutions determining the terms of exchange. And it has had unintended consequences, some beneficial and some harmful, that rippled across time and space in ways that nobody could fully predict or control. The merchants who carried spices along the Silk Road had no idea they were laying foundations for global capitalism. The European explorers who sought new routes to Asia didn't intend to trigger the Colombian Exchange. The engineers who designed shipping containers weren't trying to reshape global manufacturing and agriculture. Yet each of these developments had consequences far beyond their original intentions. This suggests humility should accompany any attempt to direct the future of food systems. The outcomes of current choices will unfold in ways that can't be fully anticipated, but that uncertainty doesn't justify inaction. It suggests the importance of resilience, of maintaining diversity and redundancy, of not optimizing so narrowly for current conditions that the system becomes brittle and unable to adapt. The global food system, built over centuries, contains enormous knowledge, infrastructure, and capability. It represents one of humanity's great collective achievements, the result of countless individuals pursuing their own interests in ways that, aggregated over time, created something larger than any could have built alone. This system feeds billions of people daily, provides livelihoods for hundreds of millions, and connects virtually every human on the planet through invisible networks of exchange. These are accomplishments worth recognizing and preserving. But this system also contains inequities, vulnerabilities, and unsustainable practices that threaten its long term viability. It concentrates power in ways that benefit some while harming others. It depletes resources and degrades environments faster than they can regenerate. It creates abundance in some places while perpetuating scarcity in others. These are failures that demand addressing and reforming. The question isn't whether the global food system should continue to exist. It will in some form because too many people depend on it. But what form it should take, what values it should embody, whose interests it should serve. There's a tendency, when confronting complex systems with deep problems, to yearn for simple solutions or wholesale replacement. Abolish corporations, return to local food, eliminate trade, rely entirely on technology. These responses have the appeal of clarity, but food systems are complex precisely because they serve multiple functions and must balance multiple constraints. They must be productive enough to feed billions, efficient enough to remain affordable, sustainable enough to continue indefinitely, resilient enough to withstand disruptions, equitable enough to maintain legitimacy. Optimizing for any one of these at the expense of others creates new problems. The challenge is finding balances, managing trade offs, and recognizing that perfection is impossible while improvement is both necessary and achievable. The individuals who make up food systems, farmers, workers, traders, processors, retailers, consumers, aren't operating within a system they designed or necessarily agree with. They're making decisions within structures they inherited, responding to incentives they didn't create, trying to survive and hopefully thrive within constraints they often didn't choose. A farmer in Iowa growing corn for export isn't responsible for the global agricultural trade regime, even though his decisions participate in it. A worker in a meatpacking plant didn't create the consolidated industrial livestock system, even though her labor enables it. A consumer buying imported fruit isn't personally responsible for agricultural labor conditions in distant countries, even though her purchase supports them. responsibility is distributed, diffused, often invisible. This makes meaningful change difficult, but not impossible. Change has happened before and will happen again. The food system of 1900 was vastly different from that of 1800. The system of 2000 was vastly different from that of 1900. The system of 2100 will almost certainly be vastly different from today's. The question is whether this change will be managed deliberately, guided by conscious choice toward desirable outcomes, or whether it will occur chaotically, driven by crises and adaptation. Both pathways are possible. History contains examples of both. Deliberate change requires vision, consensus, and sustained effort across multiple domains: technology, policy, culture, economics. Chaotic change requires only that current trends continue until they become unsustainable, at which point systems reorganize, often painfully, around new constraints. The COVID 19 pandemic offered a glimpse of what chaotic reorganization might look like: supply chains breaking, shortages appearing, people questioning assumptions, or systems adapting under pressure. The disruption was temporary and relatively minor compared to what climate change might bring, or what a major conflict disrupting trade could cause, or what cascading failures in energy systems might trigger. The global food system has been remarkably stable for the past several decades, but that stability shouldn't be confused with permanence. It's maintained by conditions that aren't guaranteed to continue. When those conditions change, the system will change, for better or worse. This brings us to a deeper question about the relationship between food and human flourishing. Food is simultaneously the most basic necessity and a source of profound pleasure and meaning. Humans don't just eat to survive. They cook, they experiment, they share meals, they develop cuisines that express cultural identity. The global food system, at its best, has enriched this dimension of human life by providing access to ingredients and flavors from around the world, by enabling culinary fusion and creativity, by making abundance affordable for more people than at any time in history. A person today has access to more variety than any emperor or king of the past. This is genuinely remarkable and shouldn't be dismissed. But this abundance has also created distance from food's origins, from the processes and people involved in its production, from the seasonal rhythms and local ecologies that once connected people more directly to the land. Many people, particularly in wealthy urban societies, have almost no direct relationship with food production. They don't know how crops grow, what seasons they follow, what labor is required, what environmental impacts result. Food appears in stores as if by magic, divorced from context. This disconnection makes it difficult to make informed choices, to understand impacts, to feel responsible for outcomes. It creates a kind of ignorance that, while convenient, also prevents the kind of awareness that might drive better decisions. There's been a recent movement, particularly in wealthier countries, toward reconnecting with food: farmers markets, farm to table restaurants, urban gardens, food education. These represent valuable efforts to rebuild understanding and relationship, but they also highlight privilege. The people who have time and money to shop at farmers markets, to visit farms, to grow gardens are not representative. Many people constrained by time, money, or access depend on the conventional food system because they have no practical alternative. Any vision for transforming food systems must account for these realities, must ensure that changes don't inadvertently harm those with the least resources and fewest options. The global food trade, over its long history, has been many things: a driver of exploration and exchange, a catalyst for innovation, a source of inequality and exploitation, a generator of abundance, a creator of dependencies. It has connected distant people and alienated nearby ones. It has enriched diets and impoverished soils. It has demonstrated human ingenuity and human short sightedness. These contradictions can't be resolved through simple narrative. The global food system is neither entirely good nor entirely bad. It's complex, containing within it both tremendous value and serious problems, both possibilities and risks. Standing here in the early 21st century, with the full arc of this history visible, certain things become clear. The impulse to trade, to seek variety and flavor, to connect across distances, is deeply human and unlikely to disappear. Technology will continue to expand possibilities, though not always in ways that benefit everyone equally. Environmental constraints will increasingly shape what's possible and what must change. Political and economic systems will continue to structure who benefits and who bears costs. And human choices, aggregated across billions of individuals and numerous institutions, will determine the trajectory. The food on your plate tonight connects you to this entire history. The grain might descend from seeds first domesticated 10,000 years ago in Mesopotamia. The spices might have traveled routes first established centuries ago by merchants seeking profit and flavor. The processing and packaging might reflect innovations from the Industrial Revolution. The logistics of delivery might depend on technologies developed just decades ago. And the decision about what to eat reflects not just personal preference, but cultural influences, economic constraints, and available options shaped by this entire system. That connection, when recognized, carries weight. It implies relationship, however distant and abstract. The farmer who grew your food, the workers who harvested and processed it, the drivers who transported it, the retailers who stocked it, all of these people participated in bringing this food to you. Similarly, the environments where it grew, the energy expended in production and transport, the water used in cultivation, the emissions generated throughout the supply chain, all of these impacts flowed from the existence of this food. Being aware of these connections doesn't necessarily change what you eat tonight, but it might influence what you eat tomorrow, or next year, or what you support politically, or how you think about food's role in your life. The story of global food trade is still being written. The chapters covering ancient trade routes, the age of exploration, industrialization, and modern globalization are complete, but the future chapters remain blank. What they'll contain depends on choices being made now and in the coming years. Will food systems become more sustainable, or will environmental degradation continue? Will power become more distributed or more concentrated? Will access become more equitable, or will inequality deepen? Will technology be deployed in service of broad human welfare or narrow corporate profit? These aren't predetermined. They're contested, subject to influence by policy, investment, activism, and individual choice. There's a temptation, when confronting the scale and complexity of global systems, to feel powerless. What can one person do against forces so vast? But systems are made of people, and they change when enough people push for change. The abolition of slavery, the establishment of labor rights, the development of environmental regulations, the creation of food safety standards, all of these emerged from people organizing, advocating, demanding better. None were inevitable. All required sustained effort against entrenched resistance. The same is true for any future improvements to food systems. They won't happen automatically. They'll require vision, effort, and persistence. As you sit down to your next meal, perhaps take a moment to consider its origins, not to burden the simple pleasure of eating with excessive contemplation, but to recognize that even the most ordinary meal contains an extraordinary history, that tomato sauce descends from fruits first domesticated in South America, brought to Europe by colonizers, spread to Asia and Africa, bred and modified over centuries. That bread comes from wheat, with a lineage stretching back 10,000 years. That coffee represents a commodity that reshaped global trade and politics. Every ingredient tells a story, and collectively they tell the story of humanity's gradual, complex, sometimes troubled, often remarkable weaving of global connection through the simple, profound act of sharing food. The global food trade isn't just an economic system or logistical network. It's a human system built by human hands and minds, reflecting human values and priorities, serving human needs and desires. As such, it can be changed, improved, redirected toward different ends. The history of food trade shows repeated transformation, each era building on what came before while creating something new. Our era has the opportunity to do the same, to take the remarkable infrastructure and knowledge that exist and reshape them toward better outcomes, more sustainable, more equitable, more resilient, more aligned with human flourishing in its fullest sense. This won't be easy. The challenges are real and the obstacles substantial. Vested interests resist change. Political will wavers. International cooperation proves difficult. Technology has limitations. But difficulty has never stopped human progress before. The same species that figured out how to preserve meat, navigate oceans, refrigerate ships, and coordinate supply chains across continents can surely figure out how to make those systems work better for both people and planet. The question is whether we will, whether the sense of urgency and possibility align in ways that enable meaningful transformation. The untold story of global food trade isn't just what happened in the past, it's what's happening now, largely invisible to those who benefit from it most, and it's what will happen next. A story still unfolding, still being shaped by countless decisions, large and small. Understanding this history, recognizing these connections, appreciating both achievements and failures, these are starting points for engagement with food systems, not as abstract, distant entities, but as immediate, personal, changeable realities. The next chapter of this story will be written by all of us through what we eat, what we support, what we demand, and what we accept. It's a responsibility that comes with living in an interconnected world, benefiting from global systems, and having the awareness to recognize both.